The iron shackles around her wrists had grown warm against her skin, but it was his gaze that burned deeper than any metal could. She stood before the assembled court, her breath shallow and quick, watching as he stepped from the shadows with the quiet authority of a storm approaching land. The silence stretched between them like a blade, sharp enough to cut through every lie she had been forced to live. Her heart hammered against her ribs as his eyes found hers across the marble floor, and she knew, with the certainty of falling, that nothing would remain the same. Before we dive into the story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Thornwick Manor like pale fingers reaching through prison bars. Elara pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the servants' corridor, listening to the echo of footsteps above. Lady Catherine's voice carried down from the grand hall, sharp and cutting as winter wind. The girl will serve at tonight's gathering. Let her learn her place among proper society. Elara's fingers traced the rough fabric of her gray dress, the only garment she possessed aside from the worn nightgown that barely kept the cold at bay. She had been brought to Thornwick as a child of 7, her parents' debt paid in blood and servitude. Now, at 19, she moved through the manor like a ghost, invisible to most, despised by others. The sound of approaching boots made her straighten. She knew that measured stride, the way each step seemed to claim ownership of the ground beneath it. Lord Adrian Blackthorne appeared at the end of the corridor, his dark coat billowing behind him like raven wings. Even in the dim light, his presence filled the narrow space, making the air feel thin and electric. He stopped before her, close enough that she could smell the scent of cedar and smoke that always clung to him. His gray eyes, the color of storm clouds, studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. She kept her gaze fixed on the stone floor, as was proper, but she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical touch. "Look at me," he said, his voice low and commanding. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had served in this house for 12 years, and had never once dared to meet his eyes directly. The servants whispered that Lord Blackthorne could see straight into a person's soul, that he possessed a darkness that both terrified and fascinated those around him. Slowly, she raised her eyes to his. The moment their gazes met, something shifted in the air between them. His expression remained unreadable, but she saw something flicker in those gray depths, recognition, perhaps, or something deeper and more dangerous. "What is your name?" he asked, though she was certain he already knew. "Elara, my lord." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. He nodded once, a slow movement that seemed to carry weight beyond its simplicity. "You will attend me in the library after the evening meal. There are matters we must discuss." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her pressed against the wall with her heart racing and her mind spinning with questions she dared not voice. The evening gathering was a torment of clinking crystal and cruel laughter. Elara moved between the guests like a shadow, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates while trying to remain invisible. Lady Catherine's friends delighted in finding fault with her every movement, their voices carrying just loud enough for her to hear. "Look at those hands," one woman remarked, her tone dripping with disdain. "Rough as a common laborer's. How unseemly. I heard she's the daughter of traders," another added, her fan fluttering like a vulture's wing. "Bad blood will always show." Elara's cheeks burned, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. She had learned long ago that any reaction would only invite more cruelty. Instead, she focused on her tasks, moving with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible. It was then that she became aware of another gaze upon her. Lord Blackthorne sat at the head of the long table, his fingers wrapped around a crystal goblet that caught the candlelight like captured fire. He wasn't participating in the conversation around him. Instead, his attention was fixed entirely on her. When their eyes met across the crowded room, she felt that same electric shock that had coursed through her in the corridor. This time, however, she didn't look away. Something in his expression held her captive, a darkness that called to something equally dark within her own soul. Lady Catherine's sharp voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Elara, you're standing there like a statue. Clear the table and retire to your quarters." The spell broken, Elara quickly gathered the remaining dishes and retreated to the kitchen. But as she worked, she could still feel the phantom weight of Lord Blackthorn's gaze, and the memory of it made her hands tremble as she washed the fine china. Hours later, when the last guest had departed and the manor had settled into its evening quiet, Ilara made her way to the library. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold marble as she moved through the darkened halls, past portraits of long-dead Blackthorns whose painted eyes seemed to follow her passage. The library door stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling from within. She hesitated for a moment, her hand raised to knock, when his voice called from inside. "Enter!" She pushed the door open and stepped into the room. The library was her favorite place in the manor, filled with books that she was forbidden to touch, but loved to admire from afar. Lord Blackthorn stood before the great fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel, his profile sharp and commanding in the flickering light. "Close the door," he said without turning around. She obeyed, the soft click of the latch seeming to echo in the vast room. When he finally faced her, she saw something in his expression that she had never seen before. Not the cold authority she was accustomed to, but something raw and almost vulnerable. "Do you know why I summoned you here?" he asked, moving closer. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Because," he said, stopping just arm's length away, "I find myself in the unusual position of caring what happens to you." The words hit her like a physical blow. In all her years at Thornwick, no one had ever expressed concern for her welfare. She stared at him, searching his face for signs of mockery or cruel jest, but found only sincerity. "I don't understand," she whispered. He reached out slowly, as if approaching a frightened animal, and touched her cheek with the backs of his fingers. The contact sent fire racing through her veins, and she had to fight the urge to lean into his touch. "There are those in this house who would see you broken," he said, his voice soft but edged with steel. "I will not allow that to happen." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she saw something fierce and protective flare in his gray eyes. "Because you deserve better than the life that has been forced upon you. Because you have a strength that others fear. And because—" He trailed off, his hand falling away from her face. "Because," she prompted, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Because I have watched you for years, seen how you endure their cruelty with grace, how you find beauty in small things, how you remain kind despite having every reason to grow bitter. You fascinate me, Ilara. You always have." The confession hung between them like a bridge. Neither was certain they should cross. Ilara felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from a joy so intense it was almost painful. "What are you saying?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "I'm saying that things are going to change," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "I'm saying that you will no longer be treated as a servant in this house. And I'm saying that if you'll have me, I would like to court you properly." The room seemed to spin around her. Lord Adrian Blackthorn, master of Thornwick Manor, one of the most powerful men in the county, was asking to court her, a servant, an orphan, a girl with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back. "The others will never accept it," she said, voicing the fear that clawed at her chest. "The others," he said, stepping closer until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, "will learn to accept what I decree. This is my house, my land, my decision. And you, if you choose it, will be my lady." She looked up into his face, seeing the determination there, the fierce protectiveness that made her feel, for the first time in her life, truly safe. But beneath that safety lurked a danger of a different kind, the danger of hope, of allowing herself to believe that her life could be something more than endless servitude and quiet desperation. "I don't know how to be a lady," she whispered. His lips curved in the faintest of smiles, the first she had ever seen from him. "Then I'll teach you. We'll learn together." Before she could respond, he cupped her face in both hands and lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers. They stood there in the firelight, breathing the same air, existing in a bubble of possibility that felt both fragile and eternal. "Say yes," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. And despite every voice in her head that screamed this was impossible, that girls like her didn't get fairy tale endings, she found herself nodding. "Yes," she breathed, and the word felt like a prayer, like a promise, like the first word of a new language she was only just learning to speak. The next morning brought chaos to Thornwick Manor. Word of Lord Blackthorn's intentions spread through the household like wildfire, carried by shocked servants and scandalized by the upper staff. Elara woke to find a new dress laid out on her narrow bed. Not the fine silk of a lady, but a respectable wool dress in deep blue that fit her perfectly and made her feel almost beautiful. Mrs. Hartwell, the head housekeeper, appeared in her doorway with a face like thunder. "His lordship requires your presence in the morning room," she said, her voice clipped with disapproval. "You're to take your meals there from now on." Elara's stomach twisted with anxiety. Taking meals in the morning room meant eating with the family, meant claiming a place at a table where she had never been welcome. But she squared her shoulders and followed Mrs. Hartwell through the corridors she had always navigated as a shadow. The morning room was bright with sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked the manor's gardens. Lord Blackthorn sat at the head of a small table set for two, reading correspondence with the same focused attention he brought to everything. When she entered, he looked up and smiled, that same small, private smile he had given her the night before. "Good morning, Elara," he said, rising to pull out her chair. "I trust you slept well." The simple courtesy of having her chair pulled out, of being asked about her comfort, nearly brought tears to her eyes. She managed a small smile in return. "Yes, my lord. Thank you. Adrian," he corrected gently as he resumed his seat. "We are to be equals now, are we not?" The idea of being equal to anyone, let alone him, felt impossible to grasp. But she nodded and tried the name on her tongue. "Adrian." He smiled again, and she felt that familiar flutter in her chest, that sensation of falling that both terrified and thrilled her. Their breakfast was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Catherine, who swept into the room like an avenging angel, her face flushed with outrage. "Adrian," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, "what is the meaning of this spectacle?" He didn't look up from his newspaper. "I believe I made my intentions quite clear in the letter I had delivered to your room this morning." "Your intentions?" Lady Catherine's voice rose to near shriek. "You cannot seriously mean to elevate this servant to the position of mistress of Thornwick." Now Adrian did look up, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "I mean to do exactly that. Elara will be my wife, Catherine. You will treat her with the respect due to the future Lady Blackthorn, or you will find yourself seeking accommodation elsewhere." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Lady Catherine's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple. Her eyes fixed on Elara with such venom that it took all of Elara's newfound courage not to shrink back. "She is nothing," Catherine spat. "The daughter of traders, raised in servitude. She knows nothing of managing an estate, nothing of society, nothing of what it means to be a proper wife to a man of your station." "Then she will learn," Adrian said calmly, "as we all learned once." "You're making a fool of yourself," Catherine continued, her voice taking on a pleading note. "Think of your reputation, your standing in society. What will people say?" "I care very little what people say," Adrian replied, folding his newspaper with precise movements. "I care about my own happiness and Elara's welfare. If society cannot accept that, then society can go hang." Lady Catherine's eyes flashed with fury, and Elara realized that this woman, who had made her life miserable for so many years, was truly dangerous when crossed. "This is not over," Catherine said, her voice low and menacing. "Mark my words, Adrian. This folly will bring nothing but ruin to this house." She swept from the room, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken threats. Elara's hands trembled as she reached for her teacup, and Adrian noticed immediately. "She cannot hurt you now," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I won't allow it." "She has power," Elara whispered. "Connections. She could make things very difficult." "Let her try," Adrian said, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. "I have power too, and connections of my own. More importantly, I have something she doesn't, the determination to protect what matters to me." His fingers intertwined with hers, warm and strong and reassuring. For a moment, sitting in the sunlit morning room with his hand holding hers, Elara allowed herself to believe that perhaps, against all odds, this impossible thing might actually work. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that Lady Catherine's parting words had been less threat than prophecy. Something in the woman's eyes had promised that this was indeed far from over, and that the battle for Alara's place at Thornwick Manor had only just begun. The following weeks passed in a blur of transformation that left Alara feeling as though she were living someone else's life. Adrian kept his word about teaching her to be a lady, engaging a series of tutors who arrived each morning to instruct her in everything from proper posture to French conversation. She learned to navigate the complex rules of etiquette, to move with grace in the fine dresses that began appearing in her wardrobe, to speak with the measured confidence expected of a woman of station. But it was the quiet moments with Adrian that truly changed her. He would find her in the library each evening, and they would talk for hours about books, about philosophy, about dreams and fears they had never shared with another soul. She discovered that beneath his commanding exterior lay a man of deep thoughtfulness, someone who had been as lonely in his elevated position as she had been in her lowly one. "I never expected to find someone who understood," he told her one evening as they sat before the fire, her hand resting in his. "I had resigned myself to a marriage of convenience, to a life of duty without joy. And I never expected to find someone who saw me as more than a burden to be endured," she replied, marveling at how natural it felt to speak openly with him. Their courtship was gentle and careful, like two wounded creatures learning to trust. He never pushed beyond what she was comfortable with, content to hold her hand, to touch her face with reverent fingers, to look at her as though she were something precious beyond measure. But their happiness existed within a bubble that grew more fragile with each passing day. Lady Catherine's campaign of subtle warfare began almost immediately. She spread whispers throughout the county about Adrian's unfortunate infatuation with a servant. She arranged social gatherings and pointedly excluded Alara from the invitations. She found a dozen small ways to remind everyone that Alara was an outsider, a pretender to a position she had never earned. The servants, too, were divided in their loyalties. Some, particularly the younger ones who had suffered under the old regime's harsh treatment, were pleased to see someone like themselves elevated. But others, especially those who had worked their way up through years of faithful service, resented what they saw as Alara's undeserved good fortune. Mrs. Hartwell was among the most vocal in her disapproval. "Mark my words," she told anyone who would listen, "no good will come of this. The natural order exists for a reason. When it's upset, everyone suffers." The pressure began to tell on Alara. She found herself questioning every word she spoke, every gesture she made, hyper-aware of the watching eyes that judged her fitness for the role she was meant to fill. The weight of being constantly scrutinized, of knowing that any mistake would be seen as proof of her unworthiness, began to crush her spirit. Adrian noticed, of course. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to read her moods, to sense when the burden became too heavy. "We could leave," he told her one night when he found her crying quietly in the garden. "Travel to London, or even to the continent. Start fresh where no one knows our history." The offer was tempting, but Alara shook her head. "This is your home, your heritage. I won't be the reason you lose it." "Thornwick is just a place," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "You are my home now." But even as he spoke the words, she could see the pain in his eyes at the thought of leaving everything he had ever known. This manor, these lands, they were part of him in a way she was only beginning to understand. She couldn't ask him to give that up, not even for love. The crisis came on a gray October morning when a visitor arrived at Thornwick Manor. Alara was in the library, struggling through a particularly difficult passage in French, when Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed triumph. "His lordship requires your presence in his study," she said. "There's a gentleman here to see you both." Alara's stomach clenched with foreboding. Visitors who came specifically to see both of them never brought good news. She smoothed her skirts and made her way to Adrian's study, where she found him standing behind his desk with a face like carved stone. Seated across from him was a thin, pale man in expensive clothes who radiated the kind of cold authority that came from wealth and power. "Ah, Miss Alara," the stranger said, rising to his feet with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Or should I say, the future Lady Blackthorn? I am Sir Reginald Pemberton, a family friend of Lord Blackthorn's late mother." Adrian's jaw tightened at the mention of his mother, and Alara felt her unease deepen. Sir Reginald continued speaking, as though he hadn't noticed the tension in the room. "I've come on a rather delicate matter," he said, settling back into his chair with the air of a man who held all the cards. "It concerns the legitimacy of Lord Blackthorn's engagement to you, my dear." "I fail to see how that is any of your concern," Adrian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, but it is," Sir Reginald replied, reaching into his coat to withdraw a leather portfolio. "You see, I've been doing some research into Miss Alara's background, and I've made some rather interesting discoveries." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a set of documents, spreading them on the desk with the careful precision of a man laying out evidence. "These are records from the parish where Miss Alara was born. Birth records, baptismal certificates, marriage licenses." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She had always been told that her parents were dead, that she was an orphan with no family and no connections. The idea that there might be records, documentation of a past she had never known, filled her with equal parts hope and terror. "What do these documents prove?" Adrian asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Sir Reginald's smile widened. "They prove, my dear lord, that Miss Alara is not the orphan daughter of traitors that Lady Catherine has claimed. In fact, she is the legitimate daughter of the late Earl of Ravenshollow, a man of impeccable reputation who died in service to the crown." The room fell into absolute silence. Alara stared at the documents, unable to process what she was hearing. She was not a servant's daughter, not a child of traitors, but the daughter of an earl? The very foundation of everything she believed about herself crumbled in an instant. "Furthermore," Sir Reginald continued, clearly enjoying the bombshell he had dropped, "according to the terms of the Earl's will, Miss Alara is entitled to a considerable inheritance, including lands and properties that have been held in trust until her majority." Adrian was staring at the documents with an expression Alara couldn't read. "How long have you known this?" he asked quietly. "I've suspected for some time," Sir Reginald admitted. "The resemblance to her late mother was quite striking, once one knew to look for it. But I only recently acquired the documentation necessary to prove it. Why bring this forward now?" Adrian's question carried an edge of suspicion. "Because," Sir Reginald said, his mask of affability slipping slightly, "there are those who believe that Miss Alara's true parentage changes everything about her engagement to you. A marriage between a Blackthorn and the daughter of Ravenshollow would be a union of equals, not the charitable gesture some have painted it to be." The implication hung heavy in the air. This revelation, which should have been a blessing, felt instead like another trap. If Alara was truly nobility, then their love story became something else entirely, not a brave choice to elevate a deserving servant, but a calculated political alliance. Alara found her voice at last. "Why was I raised as a servant if this is true?" Sir Reginald's expression grew grave. "Your father's estate was contested after his death. Lady Catherine, as your mother's cousin, was appointed as your guardian while the legal matters were sorted. She chose to simplify your circumstances while the inheritance was disputed. The truth hit Alara like a physical blow. Lady Catherine had known. All these years of cruelty, of making her feel worthless and unwanted, Catherine had known exactly who she was. The woman had deliberately stolen her identity, her inheritance, her very sense of self, and used her as unpaid labor while enriching herself from Alara's rightful estate." Adrian's hands clenched into fists on his desk. "Lady Catherine has been stealing from Alara for 12 years. The situation is complex," Sir Reginald said diplomatically. "But yes, Miss Alara has been denied her rightful place and inheritance." The room began to spin around Alara. She gripped the back of a chair to steady herself, her mind reeling with the implications of this revelation. Everything she had believed about herself, about her place in the world, had been a lie. She was not a servant elevated by love, but a lady who had been deliberately degraded and stolen from. "I need air," she whispered, and without waiting for a response, she fled from the room. She ran through the corridors of Thornwick Manor, past startled servants, and through doors that led to the gardens. Only when she reached the old oak tree at the far edge of the grounds did she stop, collapsing against its trunk as sobs racked her body. She was not who she thought she was. But more terrifying than that was the question of what this meant for her relationship with Adrian. Had he somehow known? Had their entire courtship been built on lies? And if she was truly the equal he had claimed to want to make her, what did that say about the man who had been content to let her suffer in ignorance? The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Adrian stood a few yards away, his face etched with pain and confusion. They stared at each other across the distance that suddenly felt vast and unbridgeable. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "No," he said simply. "I swear to you, Elara, I had no idea." She wanted to believe him, but trust, once shaken, was not easily restored. How could Lady Catherine have hidden this for so long? "Because she had help," Adrian said, his voice hard with anger. "Because there are people in power who benefit from keeping others ignorant of their rights." He took a step closer, then stopped when she tensed. "I know this changes everything," he said quietly. "I know you must have questions, doubts, but I need you to know that nothing has changed for me. I fell in love with you when I thought you were a servant. Learning that your nobility doesn't make me love you more or less. You are the same person you were this morning." But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. She was not the same person, because she no longer knew who that person was. The identity she had built for herself, the sense of self that had carried her through years of hardship, had been torn away and replaced with something she didn't understand. "I need time," she said, not meeting his eyes. "I need to think." She saw the pain that flashed across his features, but he nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." As she walked back toward the manor, leaving him standing alone beneath the oak tree, Elara felt as though she were walking into a future that suddenly looked nothing like the one she had dared to imagine. The truth was supposed to set her free, but instead, it felt like just another prison, one built not of servitude and ignorance, but of expectations and responsibilities she had never chosen and didn't know how to bear. The revelation of Elara's true identity spread through the manor like a fever. By evening, every servant knew that the girl they had watched scrub floors and serve meals was actually the rightful lady of Ravenshollow. The reactions were varied and intense. Some felt vindicated in their early kindness to her, others were ashamed of their cruelty, and still others were simply stunned by the magnitude of the deception that had been perpetrated. Lady Catherine had disappeared immediately after Sir Reginald's departure, taking only a small bag and leaving behind a house in chaos. Mrs. Hartwell, faced with the reality that she had spent years mistreating nobility, had locked herself in her room and refused to come out. The very foundations of the manor's social order had been shaken, and no one quite knew how to proceed. Elara spent the night in her room, not the servants' quarters she had occupied for so many years, but the guest chamber Adrian had insisted she take when their courtship began. She sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit gardens, trying to reconcile the two versions of herself that now existed in her mind. She was Elara Thornfield, daughter of the Earl of Ravenshollow, heir to lands and titles she had never known existed. But she was also Elara the servant, who had learned to find joy in small kindnesses and strength in endurance. The question that tormented her was which of these women Adrian had fallen in love with, and which one she truly was. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find a young maid she barely knew, holding a silver tray with an envelope upon it. "Begging your pardon, my lady," the girl said, her eyes wide with nervous respect. "This came for you." Elara took the envelope with trembling fingers. Her name was written across it in an elegant hand she didn't recognize. Inside, she found a letter from a firm of solicitors in London, informing her that they had been searching for her for years and requesting her presence to discuss her inheritance and the properties that were rightfully hers. The letter made it all real in a way that Sir Reginald's dramatic revelation had not. There were estates to manage, tenants depending on her, decisions to be made that would affect hundreds of lives. The responsibility was staggering, and she had no idea how to begin. Another knock came, this one firmer and more familiar. She opened the door to find Adrian, still dressed in his evening clothes, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. She stepped aside, and he entered the room, maintaining a careful distance that spoke to his understanding of her need for space. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble, "about what this means for us, for your future." Her heart clenched at the serious tone of his voice. "And what have you concluded?" "That you don't need me anymore," he said simply. "You have your own inheritance, your own lands, your own place in society. You could marry anyone you choose, a duke, an earl, someone who could offer you a position equal to your birth." The words hit her like a slap. "Is that what you want? For me to marry someone else?" "What I want," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "is your happiness. I want you to have choices, real choices, not just the gratitude of a servant elevated beyond her station." "And you think that's all this has been? Gratitude?" He ran a hand through his dark hair, disheveling it in a way that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "I don't know what to think anymore. 3 days ago, I was a man brave enough to defy society for love. Now I discover that I was simply following a path that was socially acceptable all along. It calls everything into question." Elara stared at him, seeing the doubt and pain in his gray eyes, understanding that this revelation had shaken him as much as it had her. "Do you think less of your feelings because they turn out to be convenient?" "I think," he said carefully, "that you deserve the chance to discover who you are without the complications of our relationship. You've been someone's possession your entire life, first Catherine's, then mine in a different way. Maybe it's time for you to belong only to yourself." The words were meant to be generous, but they felt like abandonment. Elara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire burning in the grate. "And if I decide I want to belong to myself and to you?" Hope flickered in his expression before he tamped it down. "Then we'll face whatever comes together. But I won't ask you to make that choice until you've had time to explore your options. You're a wealthy woman now, Elara. You could travel, see the world, experience life beyond these walls. You should do those things before you tie yourself to anyone." She wanted to argue, to tell him that she had already made her choice, and that learning about her inheritance didn't change her feelings. But a small voice in her head whispered that maybe he was right. How could she know what she truly wanted when she had never had the freedom to want anything at all? "How long?" she asked quietly. "A year," he said. "Take a year to live as Lady Ravenshollow. Reclaim your estates, meet your peers, see what life has to offer. If at the end of that time you still want what we had, I'll be here. And if I don't," pain flashed across his features, "then I'll wish you well and try to find happiness in knowing that you found yours." She wanted to close the distance between them, to take his face in her hands and kiss away the doubt she saw there. But something held her back, perhaps the same wisdom that made him offer her this freedom. "Will you wait?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "For you," he said, his smile sad but genuine. "I'd wait forever." 3 days later, Elara stood in the entrance hall of Thornwick Manor, dressed in traveling clothes that had belonged to her mother, and clutched a letter of introduction from the solicitors. A carriage waited outside to take her to London, where she would begin the process of reclaiming her inheritance and learning to be the woman she had been born to be. Adrian stood beside her, handsome and remote in his dark coat, every inch the proper gentleman saying farewell to a house guest. But when he took her hand to help her into the carriage, his fingers lingered on hers, and she saw everything he wasn't saying reflected in his eyes. "Take care of yourself," he said formally, for the benefit of the watching servants. "And you," she replied, matching his tone while her heart broke a little. As the carriage pulled away from Thornwick Manor, Elara looked back to see Adrian standing on the steps, growing smaller and smaller until he was just a dark figure against the gray stone. She pressed her hand to the window, leaving a ghost of her warmth on the glass, and whispered a promise to the wind. "I'll come back to you," she said. "Whatever I discover, wherever I go, I'll come back." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if the woman who returned would be someone he could still love, or if the year of freedom he had given her would transform her into someone too different from the servant girl he had fallen in love with. The future stretched ahead of her, bright with possibility and dark with uncertainty, and for the first time in her life, she was traveling toward it alone. The year that followed passed like a dream wrapped in silk and edged with loneliness. Elara threw herself into reclaiming her heritage with the same determination that had once helped her survive servitude. She met with solicitors and estate managers, learning the complex business of managing lands and tenants. She traveled to her family's ancestral home, Ravenshollow Castle, and wept at the beauty that had been kept from her for so long. The castle was everything Thornwick Manor was not. Ancient where Adrian's home was merely old, wild where his was controlled, mysterious where his was welcoming. Standing in the great hall where her ancestors had held court, Elara felt the weight of history settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She hired staff, restored rooms that had been closed for years, and slowly brought the castle back to life. The local tenants, who remembered her father with fondness, welcomed her with a warmth that made her eyes burn with tears. For the first time, she experienced what it felt like to be loved not despite her origins, but because of them. London society embraced her with enthusiasm that felt both genuine and calculating. As an eligible heiress with a romantic backstory, she was invited to every ball, every salon, every gathering of importance. She learned to navigate the complex, social waters with the same careful attention she had once paid to avoiding Lady Catherine's wrath. Men courted her with varying degrees of sincerity. Some were drawn by her wealth, others by the novelty of her story, and a few seemed to genuinely care for her as a person. She danced with dukes and dined with earls, allowed herself to be flattered and feted and thoroughly courted. But none of them made her heart race the way Adrian's presence had. None of them understood the parts of her that had been forged in hardship and polished by suffering. They saw Lady Ravenshollow, but they had never known Elara the servant, and somehow that made their affection feel hollow. She wrote to Adrian once a month, careful letters that spoke of her activities and discoveries while revealing nothing of the longing that ate at her like a slow fire. His responses were equally careful, full of news about the estate and the people they both knew, but empty of any emotion beyond polite friendship. As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, Elara began to understand what Adrian had given her with his year of freedom. She had needed to discover that she could stand on her own, that she had value beyond what others saw in her. She had needed to experience choices, real choices, to know that whatever decision she made was truly her own. But with each passing month, that decision became clearer. Wealth and position were comfortable, but they weren't happiness. The respect of society was gratifying, but it wasn't love. She missed the quiet evenings in Adrian's library, the way he looked at her as though she were something precious, the feeling of being truly seen and understood by another person. Most of all, she missed the sense of partnership they had begun to build, the feeling that together they could face anything the world threw at them. As autumn arrived and the anniversary of her departure approached, Elara made her final preparations. She had proven to herself and to the world that she could be Lady Ravenshollow. Now she wanted to discover if she could be Lady Blackthorn as well. The carriage that brought her back to Thornwick Manor on a crisp October morning was far grander than the one that had taken her away. She was dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk, her hair styled in the latest fashion, every inch the lady she had been born to be. But as the familiar gray stones came into view, she felt like the same girl who had fled in confusion and heartbreak a year ago. Adrian was waiting on the steps, just as he had been when she left. But this time, when she stepped from the carriage, she walked toward him with the confidence of a woman who knew her own mind. "Lord Blackthorn," she said formally, offering him a small curtsy. "Lady Ravenshollow," he replied, bowing in return. But she could see the question in his eyes, the hope he was trying to contain. "I've come to return something that belongs to you," she said, pulling off her gloves with deliberate slowness. "And what might that be?" She stepped closer, close enough to see the way his breath caught, close enough to smell the familiar scent of cedar and smoke that still made her heart race. "My heart," she said simply. "I've carried it with me everywhere this year, but it never belonged anywhere but here." The careful mask he had been wearing cracked, and she saw the man she loved looking back at her with desperate hope. "Are you certain? You've seen what the world has to offer now. You could have anyone." "I don't want anyone," she interrupted, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "I want you. I want the man who saw value in a servant girl, who taught her to believe in herself, who loved her enough to let her go so she could choose freely. And you choose this. Choose us." "I choose love," she said, rising on her toes to bridge the last distance between them. "I choose partnership. I choose the future we can build together." When their lips met, it was with the fierce joy of two people who had found their way back to each other against all odds. The servants who had gathered to watch their reunion burst into spontaneous applause, and even the gray stones of Thornwick Manor seemed to glow with warmth. Later, as they sat before the fire in the library where their love had first bloomed, Adrian took her hands in his and asked the question she had been waiting a year to hear. "Elara Thornfield, Lady of Ravenshollow, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Adrian Blackthorn," she replied, her heart full to bursting. "I thought you'd never ask." Their wedding was held at Ravenshollow Castle, with both their estate's tenants in attendance. It was a celebration that merged two great houses and two hearts that had found their way to each other through darkness and doubt to reach the light of understanding. As they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Adrian whispered in her ear, "No regrets?" Elara looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family, at the ancient walls that had welcomed her home, at the man who held her as though she were made of starlight and dreams. "None," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "This is exactly where I belong." The music swirled around them, and in that moment, she understood that sometimes the greatest gift love could offer was the freedom to choose it freely. She had been Elara the servant, Elara the lady, and now she was simply Elara, beloved and complete, ready to write the next chapter of a story that had begun in shadows but promised to end in light. Yinny, if this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts within us is what makes us most human.